Welcome to Dear Human Resources, the podcast that explores the people side of business, where we talk about talent, leadership, and the very real challenges HR faces every day. I'm your host, Marilyn Germain. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're leaving the office and stepping into a fighter jet cockpit. We'll look at what HR leaders can learn from a fighter pilot cockpit drill. Why? Because in fighter aviation, there is a zero margin for error, and yet teams move fast, they stay aligned, and they learn at high speed. Our guest today has spent his career taking that precision and bringing it to the business world. My guest is Christian Boucousis. He goes by Boo. And he is a former fighter pilot turned CEO of the company Afterburner. For 30 years, Afterburner has helped organizations translate high-stakes aviation thinking into business execution. He is the author of The Afterburner Advantage, an Amazon bestseller in leadership, and he works with Fortune 500 companies and even NFL teams that went on to win the Super Bowl. And he builds, purpose-driven, high-performance cultures. He's known for turning chaos into clarity. Boo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Sure. So let's start with the why. When people hear fighter pilot, they think, speed, adrenaline, Top Gun, but not necessarily HR. So let's connect the dots. In a fighter pilot cockpit drill, everything is structured, right? The brief, execute, debrief. Why is that rhythm so powerful, and why should HR leaders care?
Being a fighter pilot is essentially reprogramming a human being. And the whole experience of a fighter pilot, everything about it is to mitigate the blind spots of humanity. At the time, I had no idea of that. I didn't look at it that way. But it is an environment where we accept human fallibility as a given, as a natural part of someone having a strength. We don't even call it weaknesses. We just have human nature and the human condition. So what's super interesting about the way fighter pilots think, the cognitive frameworks that we use, which align seamlessly to the ways we work, they live hand in glove, was iterated over the years, and we landed at this whole concept of iterative thinking around 60 years ago when at the time Colonel John Boyd invented this idea of the OODA loop. And when we talk about cognition and when we talk about humans and growing a human being and mitigating our blind spot, what we're really talking about is thinking in loops, like bringing a feedback channel and awareness into everything that we do. And what I've certainly noticed in the last 10 years with Afterburner and helping leaders and companies kind of stop telling themselves stories about themselves and their business is if you think like a fighter pilot, you're always approaching life in how can I do this a little bit better tomorrow? And how can I help someone a little bit more? Everything about being a fighter pilot is about service. It's about teamwork and understanding that a human being by themselves is very fallible and not the most optimum element to get anything done. Even to the concept of a fighter pilot has a wingman, and if you look at fighter pilot lead and fighter pilot wingman, you're really mimicking the way the brain works. You've got one pilot who's all in on the task positive network and the busy pilot, and you've got the wingman who's the sort of the thoughtful pilot and triggering back into the default mode network, because the human brain just can't do two things at once. Not only can it not do two things at once, it can't do and think at the same time. And as we move into the digital era, where everything is so much faster, so much more overwhelming, and we're just constantly battling for attention, we really need to start thinking differently as to how we survive and thrive in the modern leadership paradigm, what I call the digital vortex.
You say that success doesn't come from motivation. It comes from mindset, from method, and from mission clarity. So let's talk a little bit about mindset. What is the biggest mindset shift HR leaders must make to lead teams that thrive under pressure rather than simply surviving it?
The obvious one is a growth mindset, that someone is committed to their personal growth and as a leader, the growth of their team. But I feel there's a nuance in mindset that fighter pilots kind of cracked. And that is mindset doesn't work without the action piece, without things happening, without behavioral change. So when we look at a fighter pilot mindset, we call it the IRCA model, IRCA, where fighter pilots are very intentional. So we don't do anything without understanding why and what the effort's going to deliver. We're also very grounded in reality and understand that who I am today is the product of I call it the 3 Bs, my biases, beliefs, and behaviors, and the relationship between the three of those. And then what they introduce to you as a fighter pilot is get curious about that and ask yourself, if I need to complete this more complex mission tomorrow and I'm not there yet today, what do I need to learn in the context of that particular destination, of that particular win? I call it missionization. And then I have to go out and do it. And once I've done it, I can reflect on it again and say, is what I did what I expected? Did I get the results I was expecting? If not, why not? And what am I going to do tomorrow? And if you take that word action, so the intention is the future mindset, the reality is the fixed mindset, and you introduce curiosity, then the actions ultimately become new behaviors. So we slowly but deliberately reframe our biases, our beliefs, and the way we behave, not just as a leader, because I think growing as a leader, you have to grow as an individual. I mean, there's no getting away from that. You have to bring contextualized reflection into your practice.
Most HR leaders don't want to sound like a drill sergeant, right? But they do want everyone on the same page. How do you think HR leaders can create a mission brief culture in an organization where every team member really understands the outcome, but also the risks and their role without sounding like a military command?
The funny thing about being a fighter pilot, it's not very military at all. They call us civilians in uniform. It's a very collegiate, collaborative environment. We don't really do orders. We just fly missions and figure out how to do it each day. The key mental shift in HR, and we do a lot in the people space with what we do because we are a human performance framework, is start with what does good look like. You know, when we, for example, look at the average performance appraisal in an organization, it's once, maybe twice a year. In the Air Force, it's every day. As a fighter pilot, every day your performance is assessed and reflected on in a way that's for you. It's not for the organization, it's for you as the pilot to get better. And we have to think and reframe our role in the organization. Is my job to serve the organization or to serve the people in the organization? Because initially those two don't tend to match. The organization has different goals to the individual. Because when we optimize the individual, when we can tell them, hey, this is what good looks like for the company and this is what good looks like for you, do you agree? If not, how do we co-create that? We're always having conversations about where we're going rather than what we're doing. Because the problem when we focus on the doing is, as you would know, and we've lived rich, full lives, is there's 2,000 ways to make a spaghetti bolognese, right? You can do it multiple different ways, but at the end of the day, it's a spaghetti bolognese. Yeah. And if it tastes a little bit different, if its purpose is to feed somebody, then let's not get too stressed about the doing. But because humans are so engineered to be busy and doing, that tends to be how we also frame the way we converse and the way we meet. All of our meetings is about work. What did you do? What have you done? Where are you at? Very rarely, and we know this from 30 years at Afterburner, we've never ever seen the behavior in the organization where everything is about the mission objective. Everything is about what good looks like. It's getting away from what you do to what do we need to achieve.
So, Boo, most of our listeners are dealing with some sort of burnout or rapid change or teams that feel, somewhat fragmented. For HR professionals in that situation, what one discipline from a cockpit drill can they adopt this week to create immediate clarity and improved execution?
Sit down and have a debrief. And when I say have a debrief, It sounds military, have a debrief, but just spend the time to reflect on what's going on. At Afterburner, we created a 4-step debrief process. It's called ORCA, ORCA. So we get our people in a room. We're burned out because we're all heading in different directions. We're all hyper reactive. And we have a saying as fighter pilots, you have to fly the airplane. You can't let the airplane fly you.
Right.
And as technology becomes all pervasive, it's insidiously stealing our attention. It's insidiously stealing our problem solving and critical thinking skills. So the wonderful thing about a debrief is the conversation is anchored with an objective. And the reason why that word, and again, words need to have a meaning. And the reason why we use that word objective is because humans are by nature subjective. And you can't debrief a subjective point of view because everything becomes personal. When we're objective, your goal is to achieve this sales target. Your goal is to get the contract out within 48 hours. Your goal, all of a sudden, that anchors a conversation. And we can say, well, the result was the contract went out in 72 hours. Not a big deal. Let's not get stressed about it. This is a zero emotion space. So the R is the result. The result is it's a day late. C is cause. What's the cause of the delay? And it's here where that individual is going to run through their thought processes. Oh, well, this is what I expected. This team member let me down. That becomes an excuse. As a leader, your job is to say, okay, so that person let you down. What can you do next time to get ahead of that? How can you impart upon that person the urgency that you need and create the personal win? And go and find that person and debrief with them so that doesn't happen again. So the action is like, okay, cool. Well, something happened outside my control. It made me a day late. I understand now why it was a day late. I'm going to go and sit down with that other person and help them understand what I need them to do next time. So when we talk about most organizations, the leadership models are hierarchy-based, industrial era-based, and oriented towards management. So it's not called leadership. If you manage something, it means you're managing something that already exists, whereas leadership is moving people into the future that doesn't exist. That's what leaders do. When we create hierarchy, we create the paternal, maternal kind of leadership model, which is not very good for performance. If you think of the way in which you bring up a child, eventually they stop listening to mum and dad. And what happens in organizations is you end up with this artificial harmony where everyone's just like nodding their head, keeping everyone happy, but we're not going anywhere. So you've got to create this intentional parallel universe of zero emotion, results-driven conversations that is completely objective. So the number one thing to do as an HR leader is to sit down and debrief with it doesn't even have to be a performance issue. If you want to elevate someone's performance, if you want to get them into another leadership role, sit down and ask them, hey, what does good look like for you? What does good look like for you in that role? Here's what it looks like for the company. Now let's go on a journey together to bring those two worlds together. And that's when we move into like structured planning, and that's a different step in our process.
So you have worked with hundreds of organizations and leaders, right? You've seen what sticks and what doesn't. Where do organizations most often go wrong when they try to import a high performance system like that? And what do you think gets lost in translation?
It's busyness. So it's overwhelm. So when we talk about overwhelm, we're talking about this phenomenon of task saturation, that we just keep loading ourselves up with to-do lists to the point that we kind of break and we procrastinate. We sit back on our heels and we just wait for an alarm to go off, wait for someone to text me, wait. So we become entirely passive. Yeah. We're not leaning forward and we're not adaptive. So we end up with this whole react paradigm rather than think act paradigm. So the burnout and the overwhelm, the great news about it is it's self-inflicted. You choose as a human being, on average, to consume the same amount of information per day that your grandparents consumed in their entire lifetime. That's a choice. You don't have to consume that much information. However, fundamental human behavior is to be busy, to be distracted, to consume vast amounts of information. So again, it's just about bringing that intentional practice where we ask ourselves, and it's always the same question, no matter what the problem, it's where are we going with this? Like what happens after all the effort's expended? And I'll tell you, as a fighter pilot in a squadron, if someone asks you to do something and they don't explain why, it won't get done. People just don't do it because I don't have time to do it. So that's where we start to look at through the lens of, as a fighter pilot, we value time in seconds, minutes, and hours, whereas most people value time in years, quarters, months, and weeks. We lose this opportunity to set each day up as a mission. You can achieve a lot in a day if you're really intentional about setting that destination.
Boo, you have worked with sports team, the NFL, for example, who went on to win the Super Bowl, by the way. What did they do differently in their debriefs or preparation that business teams could copy tomorrow?
Before we worked with the New York Giants, they reviewed performance. They'd go out, they'd train, they'd come back, they'd watch tapes. And what style of learning you had there was like a behavioral style where a player did something wrong, the coach says, you did this wrong, do this next time. The player would nod their head and away they go. The problem with that is it doesn't get the motors running in the brain. It doesn't create cognition. So we reframed it in the way that the questions were then asked is, what did you believe the play was there? What did you then do? Why did you do that? And you would inevitably find that there was always cues leading up to that. And you'd say, what would you do next time? In fact, when we started it, we kicked the coaches out of the room and the players just self-diagnosed, and that became the habit. You've got to empower people to learn for themselves. When it comes to the one-way consumption of information today, there's no learning going on. It's just information overwhelm. There's no wisdom. The wisdom requires intention, and it requires a commitment to learn for yourself. So as an HR director, and I see HR in two lenses. One is a compliance lens, but I think HR should really be looking at the business from an optimum human performance lens. It's to really bring and help people, because your people around you, if you say to them, hey, be intentional, that doesn't mean anything. It's like, okay, well, my intention is to be a good person. Well, that's all of our intentions. But you've got to be able to coach them and say, okay, if your intention is to make this amount of sales, what does the target look like today? Like, what do you want to achieve today? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I've sat in a room with 20 executives in one of the 10 largest companies of the United States and just asked a very simple question. What is the objective of your job? When does everyone know you've done a good job? Not a single person in that room could answer the question. So you just think of the effect of that as it cascades down the organization where everyone else is trying to figure out, hey, what do you want me to do for you as a team member? And that leader can't even figure out what it is they want to achieve. That is typical behavior in a large enterprise.
I have one more question. Why did you name your company Afterburner?
So an afterburner on a jet aircraft is put on the back of a normal jet engine. So a fighter jet engine and an airplane and an airliner, they're basically the same. But an afterburner injects raw fuel and it doubles its performance. But it doubles it at a very expensive cost. It uses a lot of fuel. So we look at afterburner as acceleration of performance. But to accelerate performance, you've got to be very focused, short, sharp, very focused execution, and then come back out of the afterburner to reflect, to design the next mission, and then go and do it again. So afterburner is an accelerator, but it also respects the fact that you can't run on afterburner all the time.
For our listeners here, Boo's book is called The Afterburner Advantage. And if you lead HR, OD, learning and development, or if you're just trying to run large changes with a small team, this is a great translation of fighter pilot execution into business. Boo, I want to thank you for being our guest here today on Dear Human Resources.
Thank you, Marilyn. I had an absolute ball. It was a real pleasure. Thank you for those very insightful questions.
Support for this show comes from Western Carolina University, a campus of the University of North Carolina system, with the technical assistance of Kelly Minnis.